Hello, and welcome to another short box from Warhammer 40k's Grim History from Beyond. I'm Zeckthar, and this week we'll be talking about the end of the founding of the Empire, which is called the Great Scouring. This week, I will give general overview of the whole conflict. In the following weeks, I will go into further depths on some of the more important parts of the Scouring, such as the Second Founding, the fall of Rebound Gilliman, and the laughable rise of the Imperial cult. But, without further ado, let's get into this, shall we?
Horus was dead. After a long and brutal war, the Tyrant King had been wiped from existence by the Emperor of mankind. But this came at a cost. The Emperor was mortally wounded by the War Master, having his internal organs squished, and his arm lopped off. Rogel Dorn found him this way, clinging to life on the vengeful spirit. The Primarch quickly took him to the Golden Throne, where he resides to this very day. Now, we'll get more into this when we talk about the Imperial cult. But what is important right now were the final orders he gave before he was strapped into the Golden Throne. The Emperor did not give orders on how to rule the Empire or how to try to put it back together again. Instead, what he did was pronounce judgment on the traitors. He declared them excommunicate traitores, and determined that they were to be driven into the hellish region of the warp rift called the Eye of Terror, which would hold them for all of eternity. All records and memory of the traitor legions were to be expunged from the Imperial archives. Worlds such as Esphon 5 and the Traitor Legion homeworlds would be scoured clean of all life because of their corruption by chaos. The Traitor Legions associated troops from the Dark Mechanicum, the Titan Legions, and the regiments of the starships of the Imperial Army and Armada Imperialis that had turned to chaos were to be destroyed or driven into the Eye. It would be as if the Traitor Legions and their mortal allies had never existed to sully the Imperium with their betrayal. Well, to me this seems somewhat short-sighted, mainly because for the Empire of Man to survive, the traitor army would have to be pushed back, which is obvious. But the big question is, what comes next? Well, we will get into that in a minute, but right now, it's time to hunt some traitors. Rebound Gilliman took control of the Imperium, and then as a single mighty force, they stormed the galaxy. No. Sorry, I'm kidding. That didn't happen. Well, Rebound Gilliman did take control of the Imperium as Lord Commander, and he did eventually bring the Empire under control. This was a period of monumental violence, of confusion, and darkness. Though the newly founded Imperium fought to root out corruption and expose wrongdoers to the cold light of imperial justice, the galaxy's scope and dark-shadowed reaches worked against them. With new betrayals and cries for vengeance emerging daily, a great many bloody-handed deeds went unseen. The ravaged Space Marine legions were no exception to this, with many striving to cover up their own misdemeanors or exact their pound of flesh from those who had wronged them. The Dark Angels, Space Wolves, Iron Hands, and even the Ultramarines all followed their own agendas as the wars of the Great Scouring gathered pace. Horus's death had not ended the fighting, but it had renewed the resolve of the Loyalists to destroy the traitors. Many Imperial worlds, during the heresy, had refused to commit their forces to either side, or seceded entirely from the Imperium to regain their own independence. Such indecision was punished by Loyalist and traitor forces alike. These forces were often bled white, attacking the rebel strongholds of worlds that only wanted to be free of the Imperium entirely, whether it swore allegiance to the Emperor or the Dark Gods. Fighting continued for another 7 standard years after the Horus Heresy had ended with Horus's death on the bridge of the great flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, before the traitor forces were wholly destroyed or exiled into the Eye of Terror. Many chaos-corrupted star systems were cleansed and placed under the watch of the newborn Inquisition. Now, while I said 7 years, that is a rough estimate. Just like the Great Crusade, it flows into the next era known as the Time of Rebirth, which flows all the way into the Forging, We do know that the Great Scouring started in 014.M31 and ended sometime before the First Block Crusade in 781.M31. Now, what took place in between this time is rarely chronicled, mainly because this is a very dark time for the Imperium. Mistakes were made, people were butchered in the name of righteousness, only to be discovered that they really weren't, just simply fed to the mighty war machine of the Empire. Yet during this time, great changes were made to how the military of the Imperium functioned. These changes swept through both the Imperial military and the offices of the government. The Extertus Imperialis, also known as the Imperial Army, was divided up into separate branches of the Astra Militarum, now known as the Imperial Guard, and the Navis Imperialis, now known as the Imperial Navy. The Space Marine Legions, the vast fighting formations so instrumental in mankind's victories during the Great Crusades, were broken into many smaller chapters comprising of only 1,000 Astartes. This transition allowed for great tactical flexibility without placing the command of an entire Space Marine Legion into the hands of one individual. Never again would the awesome power of 100,000 Space Marines be misused. All of these post-heresy reforms were overseen by Roboute Guilliman, who was now serving as Lord Commander of the Imperium and the Imperial Regent in the wake of the Emperor's incapacity. During this period, Guilliman also penned his magnum opus, the Codex Astartes, a great and sacred tome which covered every conceivable topic of military organization, strategy, and tactics for the newborn Adeptus Astartes. The loyalist Space Marine legions that had been decimated during the drop site massacre of S-5, being the Raven Guard, Iron Hands, and Salamanders, were slowly reestablished using what little gene seed the survivors had managed to escape with. The original first founding Space Marine legions were divided into smaller successor chapters, one chapter maintaining their parent legion's original name, badge, and colors, while the remaining chapters took new names and heraldry. These original chapters and their immediate successors were known as the Second Founding Chapters, an event which occurred in the early 31st millennium and coincided with the beginning of what was known as the Time of Rebirth for the Imperium. So if you really want to boil it down, the end of the Great Scouring came when the second founding took place in 021.M31. Now, most unfortunately to us chroniclers, with the Emperor confined to the Golden Throne and the Imperium left effectively leaderless, the forces of chaos and all the enemies of the Imperium, like the Orcs and the Eldari pirates, swept down on the defenseless worlds which had already been ravaged by the terrible infighting during the heresy. With so much of its strength siphoned off fighting heretics, many colonized planets were ripe for invasion. Sensing this, these predatory aliens closed in on all sides until, on every frontier, worlds burned and were lost. Not even systems once thought unassailable were safe from the rapacious Xenos threat. Like I said before, unfortunately, giving an end to the Great Scouring makes it rather difficult. So, even though Roboute Guilliman did his best to control the Imperium, some would say that the Great Scouring bled on past 021.M31. And I think this is a fairly accurate simply because during this time we get a major change in direction of the Imperium of Man. Now, if Guilliman had remained at the helm during this time, I believe that the Great Scouring would have had a definite end. And then a time probably known as the Rule of the Sun, or some other era would have taken place. Unfortunately, Guilliman was struck down. Another point we will discuss in this series. And the Empire floundered for a bit until the rise of the Imperial cult. Without the Emperor to lead humanity directly, the sheer threats of the galaxy presented to humanity led the High Lords of Terra to create an Imperial Administratum that was increasingly authoritarian, highly bureaucratic, ponderous, and often uncaring towards the individual human lives as long as its authority was maintained. Religion also became an important tool of social control, as the original rationalist and atheistic imperial truth favored by the emperor was jettisoned for the growing and once illegal imperial cult, which I'm sure you all know started the bloody Horus Heresy with Lorgar and the Word Bearers. Regardless, as the vengeance campaign known as the Scouring swept back over the human-controlled parts of the galaxy, these new sects followed closely behind. With a few hundred Terran years of the Emperor's sacrifice, the multitude of smaller cults had been absorbed into the largest and strongest sects, the most powerful of which was known as the Ecclesiarchy, after its elected clerical leader, the Ecclesiarch. This aggressive body grew so large and dominant over the years that early in the 32nd millennium, it gained the status of official state religion of the Imperium and the concomitant title of Adeptus Ministerium. The growth of this church cemented the loyalty of the Imperium amongst the teeming masses of humanity, and at the same time, that religious faith provided a modicum of comfort against the often harsh realities of the galaxy. Now, I hope you like this overview, but let me make it clear what we will be following in the coming weeks. 1. How Roboute Guilliman tried to pull the Empire back together while setting up the second founding. 2. The fall of Roboute Guilliman and how it affected the rest of the Empire. 3. The Imperial Cult and how it changed the course of the Empire to this very day. 4. This is one of my favorites. The Saga of the Iron Cage. And we will discuss how Rogel Dorn took his whole pivot of change. And 5. How the Loyalist Space Marine chapters continued on during the Great Scouring. In particular, the White Scars, Ultramarines, Space Wolves, Dark Angels, and the Blood Angels. Now this one we will go over for the next 5 weeks after we have concluded with the major events. If you enjoyed this box, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. But most importantly, stay tuned for next week. And as always,
This is Zeckthar, signing off.